On November 5, 2017, a domestic abuser full of hate for the church and for people who believe in God opened fire at the First Baptist Church in Sutherland Springs, Texas. He killed 26 people and wounded 22 more in the most violent attack against a house of worship in U.S. history. The following message is a glimpse from Frank and Sherry Pomeroy, the church pastor and his wife. They will be joining the FBSN October 25, 2025, to further the message of the martyrs from this incident and provide a wake-up call to churches that complacency is your enemy.
You represent one of the thousands of churches that me or others we weren't on your radar, and there's still lots of churches like that we've never spoke to, that have never heard this message. And it's not a doomsday message at all. It's just a simple message to be ready, and to have an intentional program. And I know this whole topic is painful. I want to be careful with how we move forward in this, but the fact of the matter is, I believe you both would agree with me, in traumatic incidents, it helps us to talk about it. Am I right? Has it helped you all to be able to share your story?
Absolutely. That is a giant part of my healing process.
I bet. Frank?
I don't talk about it as much, but again, it helps me to know that I'm getting the message out that you just spoke about, which is complacency is your enemy. So if I can reach these little churches that are complacent or have that feeling of it just won't happen to me, that makes it part of my healing.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, Frank, you've told our audiences many times about that meeting that you had at supper in Oklahoma City on November 4th, 2017, just the evening before this all happened. Do you mind going over that again, the discussion you had at the supper table?
Sure. For those that don't know, I was at a training event I was representing or was the direct manager of a summer camp, RA, Royal Ambassadors Camp. And we wanted to include primitive firearms into the camp. We already had a rifle range. There's many spiritual lessons you can teach with the primitive firearms and gets the boys' attention. But the only time they have the qualifications for that to be able to get certified to be able to teach it at camp was that weekend. So, and it was only in Oklahoma City. So I had to drive up there on Friday, go through the paperwork part on Saturday, the actual classes, if you will, which most people that are there already know all that, but you still got to go through the classes and you qualify on Sunday. So we do all our schoolwork, if you will, on Saturday. And then all of us, there's 2 proctors and 6 of us students, if you will. And we went to Golden Corral for dinner. And at the Golden Corral, we were sitting there talking, and that's when the 2 proctors came down and sat with me. And the man who was leading that started sharing with me the numbers of church shootings, which I really did not recognize at the time as being that many. And also, too, it just wasn't on my radar. Being from South Texas, Texas being a place where everybody is armed, if you will, no, it just wasn't on my radar. At the time, I kind of thought we had this system in place. Now I look back, it was just a good old boy because we were just more complacent than anything else. But as he was sharing those things with me, I told him, and I still remember the words, I looked at him and said, well, that won't happen at our church because we are in South Texas in a little rural country church where people know there's firearms in the church. I had been known to have firearms on the pulpit to use as sermon illustrations. So in my mind, it just could not happen. And then obviously the next morning, as we are gathering, getting ready in the facility, I get the text from my videographer that we have an active shooter. And that's when I texted back and said, "That's not funny." And he said, "No, this is real." And then, as we know, everything progressed from there.
And for our listeners who may not be aware, this has resulted in the most deadly attack in American history. And we, our heart still hurts for you, Frank and Sherry. And how many were lost that day, and tell a little about your personal connection to that.
We lost 26 of our closest friends. That includes our 14-year-old daughter, Annabelle, and 22 more were wounded, and 24 more were wounded, excuse me. And it was quite a shock to come back to. I also was out of town. I was working for a contractor for FEMA in Florida at the time for the hurricanes we had in 2017. And it took me 12 hours to get back home by flight. So Frank and I met in San Antonio right about the same time, Sunday night at 10 o'clock or something like that. And that was the first time we got together there.
And most of those that are lost was the leadership of the church. Therefore, I'd been working with them for many, many years, 15, 18 years, most of them. And my kids had grown up with them as being youth pastors and leaders in the church. So these people were basically family. They were our church family, but even beyond that, many of which was deemed this family, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Man, and you had to also hear that the news that Annabelle was among the victims, Frank, and then you had to find the right way and the right time to tell Sherry. And as I recall, you told her before she got on the plane to come home.
Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed the luxury of being able to find the right time, because before I had even left Oklahoma City, it was already on the radio in my truck that the pastor's daughter was one of those who was lost. And so, me knowing that Sherry was going to be flying back, all those monitors within the terminals, I thought I was going to have CNN or whomever on, and rather than her see or hear that from a monitor in waiting on an airplane, when I called and told her there was a shooting, but I did not give her any more information. But after hearing it on the radio, then I had to call her and share the news about Annabelle, that Annabelle didn't make it before she heard it from a monitor in the middle of a terminal somewhere.
Sure.
So the reporters never gave me the opportunity to really be able to share that message in a more tactile way, if you will.
And I was already getting calls from the media before I got to the airport that was 10 miles away.
Oh my goodness. Oh, Sherry, I can't imagine. We've interviewed people who, have lost a child while they were there with them before. And I don't know which would be harder. There's just not an easy way to lose a child.
Right. But that's part of my story too, is how I fought survivor's guilt. And we can get into that more at the session, mental health and how to fight survivor's guilt, how to, forgive yourself for all of that survivor's guilt entails.
Well, the two of you have been a model to the world ever since 2017. And I know you didn't step into that box willingly or even ever wish for it. But nonetheless, your story has been used to reach thousands. You're a model of a Christian man and wife who have walked through the valley of the shadow of death. And you're still close, and you have a message of hope that I so appreciate.
And I think our story is unique in our healing as well, because I was very open and about my healing and about my anger and about my feelings, whereas Frank healed another way. And I think the contrast of that when we speak gives people hope that, okay, I'm not alone out here. If she can be angry and still be a Christian, maybe there's hope for me.
Yeah.
That was one of the things I share with people even to this day, regardless of the trauma that their life goes through, that you can have hope. But at the same time, you have to realize that people grieve differently, because that was one of the things I think that tears couples apart or entities apart, is we get in a hole and we think everybody has to feel like we do or grieve like we do. And Sherry and I grieve completely differently.
And it took us years to find that out, and for me to be okay with that difference.
Yeah.
Just the way God.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it's just the way God prepared us for that moment through our lives. God designed us to be able to, we're sharing that reaches probably a whole different subset of people than I can reach. I'm more military and organized minded, where she was able to reach more those whose hearts are broken and able to reach that direction as well. And together, God uses our testimony to help people see there's hope, regardless of where your personality falls in here. God's still God, and we both can keep looking to Him.
Yeah. Oh, you have both demonstrated that so well, and I'm fairly certain you've met David and Marie Works through the years at some of our events, who lost two daughters at the New Life thing. And it was David that first told me this concept that you've just touched on. He said his grieving process was so much different than Marie's, and he tells our audiences that he went through it pretty quick and still has episodes, but he said your mileage may vary. Was the way he worded it. And
yeah, that's a good analogy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Frank, one of the messages you have given, based partially on that conversation you had in Oklahoma City the night before, uh, you've had a summation of that you've told churches. What do you tell churches about uh, preparing for such a thing?
Well, and what I try to, the biggest message I put out there is to remind people that complacency is your enemy. You have to step away from that and actively research and get involved with the safety of your church. God expects you to trust Him, yes. However, He has given us things and people and entities around us to be able to utilize to be able to put our faith and hope in Him through them, to protect
Mm-hmm.
us and set up a true workable safety plan. Whether it's a child choking on a hot dog in the fellowship hall, or God forbid, if you have an active shooter, you are now prepared with a good safety response team to integrate themselves into the church and do what's needed. So that's why I share with people is you've got to quit, step away from, well, God's just not going to let that happen here. We are not God, and God does things that confound the wise. Therefore, use the things and the brains that God has given us to go forth and put together a good plan, so that whatever we can imagine, we have tried to think it through and have a an operation in order to protect the flock. That's the shepherd's number one goal, is to share the message and protect the flock. And if we sit in a bastion of complacency, we're failing our duty, I believe. And just the simple, I share all the time what I heard Colonel Grossman say is the simplest, but yet one of the most effective measures you can do is just lock the door. Come up with a system of someone to let people in and out. Anyone visiting our church would not even realize the door was locked because they were met at the door, hugged, loved, brought in, and everything. But yet it was all done with security in mind.
Yeah, that's so
You
true.
just got to bring those ideas to churches, to people like Sherry, who just never would have thought about it. We thought that we had kind of gone over it in our heads, but then afterwards we realized we didn't have a real plan. We should have sought out real advice, intentional advice prior, rather than after. But now we can go and share with people. Do it now rather than reactive. Be preemptive rather than reactive.
Yeah. Well, there's been a number of incidents, as you all are aware of, because they're more on your radar now, to use your quote from earlier. There's the Annunciation Church in Minneapolis. If you had an opportunity, Sherry, to speak with their parents, what would come out of your heart?
Well, I know you've heard my Christy story. It's rather long. I don't know if you want to go into it at this time. My first glimmer of hope came from a lady named Christy. And this is what I tried. I worked the FEMA floods this last summer, and I told many moms that lost children this story. And I think God used that powerfully. But when this was my first trip to the hospitals to see our wounded, and this lady got in the back seat with me, and I didn't know who she was. And like I have already said, I was angry. So I didn't want to talk about God, or I didn't want anybody preaching to me. I was angry. And this lady was sitting where my friend should have been. And I was resentful of that as well. That should have been Carla and Lou going with me. Climbed in the truck with me to go to the hospital. Her husband was in the front. And she said to me, I know you don't know me, but God told me to share this story with you. And I had my walls up high, and I just sat and listened to her. And she said, when I was 9 years old, my family and I went to the Texas coast, and my dad got caught in a riptide, and he nearly died. And I saw him get rescued by the lifeguards, saw them bring him up to shore. I saw him fighting them. He was gray. He was convulsing. He was in so much pain. And we thought he was going to die, and they revived him. And she said, and then years later, me and my dad talked about that instance. And I told him what I just told you. And he looked at me funny and said, Christy, I was not in pain. And she said, I saw you in pain. You were convulsing and you were gray. We thought you were dead. And he said, I didn't feel anything, Christy, except perfect peace. And she ended her story by saying, I have no idea why God told me to tell you that story, but that's all I have. And by then, my walls crumbled and I was crying, and I was able to blubber to her and tell her that I had been dealing with survivor's guilt, wondering what my Annabelle was doing in those 17 minutes. And by her story, I know that God had his protective hand on top of Annabelle. And no matter what other people saw Annabelle doing, just as she saw her dad in distress, Annabelle didn't feel that distress because my merciful God had his hand over her. And if I don't cling to that, I would go insane. That story has sustained me these years. And I don't think I would be the same person without Christy's story.
That is a beautiful story, Sherry. I've heard you
Yes.
tell that a few times, and that's one of the reasons why we love to have you both in front of our audiences. The way you each present, one of you talks a little bit, and then the other one talks a little bit. It helps our audiences so very much,
Yeah.
and we are so looking forward to every time we can bring you in front of an audience, and that
And
brings us
each,
to one of the current points is we are going to be with you again in Mission, Texas on October the 25th, and in front of a live group of church security operators and the law enforcement who helps them. And there is nothing like hearing the story from somebody who was there and has the ability to talk about it. And the reason you have the ability to talk about it is you care about the people in the audience. That's
Amen.
the first time I ever attended your church after the incident down there. I could hear the feeling from your heart. You love the people in your congregation. And it doesn't matter if it's a congregation that's sat with you for 20 years or all new faces. You love them. And
right.
it shows. And
And
we,
each year as we heal, God gives us more of a testimony. As you know, we retired from Sutherland Springs nearly 3 years ago, right? 3 years ago, yeah. And we have had personally a good time of healing that we didn't have time to concentrate on while
yeah,
we were serving at the church. And God has blessed this time and really made us even closer. And we have many more testimonies and of healing since we've met.
yeah. Well, the Lord's done an amazing thing in your lives and in the lives of others because of your lives. And we are just so grateful for who you have become in God's army because you're telling a story that needs told, and
Yeah.
we so appreciate it.
And my story is, if I can make it through, so can you.
What a great bookend on this. I love that. Frank, is there anything you want to say um, as a
I
bookend?
would just remind people. I would just remind people of Romans 8:28 that all things can be used for the good, and I say that because we, as you say, we have been asked to speak all over many churches and able to share about hope, but also at the same time share about being proactively involved in the security and the safety of your church. And we have been told one of the biggest was White Church. Um, and he said the reason why they had their people in place to be able to take care of that active shooter was because of what happened in Sutherland Springs. And to know that so many, just the ones we know, Lord only knows how many we don't know of, how many lives have been saved by those 26 martyrs in Sutherland Springs, if you will. And that's,
Yeah,
and to me, they're martyrs. You know,
yeah,
I'm
you
going to share
bet.
one quick thing with you. I asked the Lord one time, um, we don't always get answers, direct answers the way we want them or how we understand them. But one time I asked the Lord, why did you take all my leadership? You took the core of the church. I didn't understand, but I almost had not an audible voice, but I felt it in my spirit so strong. I took those whom you already knew were saved, and therefore they're at peace, and I will use their life now to further the message that needs to be done. And I had such peace at that because then I realized uh, they just got early retirement. They're in His presence and still being used by their testimony here to share with others. And that's how God uses all things for his good for those who love him and called according to his purpose. And so I like to remind people about that. No matter how ugly it may seem, and it did break God's heart, but at the same time, he had reason. And I just have to trust that.
Yeah. To die is gain, to live is Christ.
Amen.
And boy, you both speak these words um, with the covering of experience. You've been there,